Imagine a camera soaring over the jagged white peaks of the Arctic. Below, the landscape is a brutal, wind-swept desert of ice, beautiful but deadly. In the distance, a massive radar installation looms over the permafrost, its dish rotating with a rhythmic, mechanical hum. But as we draw closer, the markings aren't American. The flag snapping in the sub-zero gale isn't the stars and stripes. It is the crimson banner of a hostile power. For nearly a century, we have looked at Greenland as a silent guardian, a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier that shields the American heartland from the frozen north. In our world, it is the cornerstone of Western defense, the quiet sentinel that ensures the North Atlantic remains a NATO lake. But in this timeline, the sentinel has defected. Greenland is no longer the shield, it is the dagger. A 2 million square kilometer block of ice pressed firmly against the throat of the United States. To understand the gravity of this shift, you have to understand the Geopolitics gap. Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. These three land masses form a strategic choke point that dictates who controls the Atlantic. In our history, the U.S. and its allies held the keys to this gate, bottling up Soviet ambitions behind a wall of sensors and steel. But if you remove the first and largest pillar of that defense, Greenland, the gate doesn't just swing open, it vanishes. Without Greenland, the security of the entire Western Hemisphere collapses. The Atlantic Ocean, once a protective moat thousands of miles wide, becomes a highway for a predator. This is the story of a world where the North was lost, where Washington was left blind and vulnerable, and where the Cold War was fought under a permanent, frozen shadow from the top of the world. A world that was only one no away from becoming our reality. To understand how we got to the brink, we have to look back at the moment the world almost changed. The year was 1946. World War II had ended, but a new, colder shadow was stretching across the globe. President Harry Truman looked at a map of the world and saw a massive, frozen void that he knew he couldn't leave to chance. He made an offer that sounds like something out of a historical myth. $100 million in gold for the entire island of Greenland. To Truman, it wasn't just land, it was insurance. If you look at a standard map on your wall, Greenland looks like a distant, peripheral wasteland. But the generals in the Pentagon weren't looking at Mercator projections. They were looking at polar projections, the view from the top of the world. From this perspective, the truth is terrifyingly clear. Greenland isn't out of the way, it is the center of the board. It sits directly on the shortest flight path for bombers and missiles traveling between Moscow and New York. In the dawning age of nuclear warfare, whoever held Greenland held the ultimate high ground. In our world, diplomacy won the day. While Denmark politely declined to sell the island outright, they recognized the existential threat of the Soviet Union. In 1951, the two nations signed a landmark defense treaty. This agreement allowed the United States to build Thule Air Base, a massive, high-tech fortress carved into the permafrost. It became the crown jewel of the North, a place where American radar could see over the curve of the Earth, catching the first hint of an incoming strike before it ever reached the Canadian border. It was the line in the ice that kept the peace for decades. This was our reality, a stable, predictable partnership that turned the Arctic into a shield. But history is fragile, and in 1951, that shield was one political tremor away from shattering. Imagine a different 1951. Instead of a handshake in Washington, there is a cold silence in Copenhagen. In this timeline, the scars of the Nazi occupation have left the Danish people fiercely protective of their sovereignty. A surging wave of nationalism sweeps through the Danish parliament, fueled by a simple, powerful sentiment: never again a foreign boot on our soil. Sensing an opportunity, Moscow leans in with surgical precision. Soviet diplomats, backed by the implicit threat of the Red Army sitting on the edge of Europe, offer a devil's bargain: total Danish independence and lucrative trade deals, provided the Americans are sent home. Under immense domestic and Eastern pressure, the Danish government makes a choice that sends shockwaves through the Pentagon. They formally reject the 1951 Defense Treaty. There will be no Thule Air Base. There will be no American shield in the high north. Instead, Denmark declares a policy of armed neutrality, a desperate attempt to stand alone between two titans. The transition is swift and brutal for Western strategy. By the end of the year, the United States is served an eviction notice. The temporary weather stations and airstrips established during World War II, lifelines for Atlantic navigation, are shuttered. American flags are lowered over the permafrost, and the last transport planes roar south, leaving behind nothing but empty barracks and a massive, silent void. For the first time since the darkest days of 1941, the North Atlantic is no longer an American lake. It is a frontier without a guard, a gateway left wide open to anyone bold enough to step through the snow. The first domino has fallen, and the unsinkable aircraft carrier is now adrift. The vacuum left by the Americans doesn't stay empty for long. In Moscow, the Kremlin sees a geopolitical miracle unfolding. Within weeks of the final American departure, the Soviet Union extends a hand to Copenhagen, offering a non-aggression and development pact. To a Danish government desperate to avoid becoming a Cold War battlefield, the offer looks like a lifeline. It promises massive Soviet investment in Greenland's infrastructure and a formal guarantee of Danish sovereignty, all under the guise of peaceful coexistence. But the fine print contains a partnership in Arctic research that serves as a Trojan horse. By 1953, the first Soviet scientific expeditions begin to arrive in the deep water ports of Nuuk and the frozen expanse of Thule. On paper, these are geologists and meteorologists exploring the secrets of the ice. In reality, the men stepping off the heavy transport ships carry the unmistakable bearing of the Soviet Military Engineering Corps. They aren't there to study the weather, they are there to build. Massive concrete foundations are poured into the permafrost, and high-frequency radio towers reach like skeletal fingers against the flickering aurora borealis. These are not laboratories. They are listening posts and forward operating bases. In Washington, the mood turns from frustration to pure cold panic. The Pentagon's master plan for the DEW line, the distant early warning system, is effectively decapitated. The DEW line was meant to be a seamless radar fence stretching from Alaska to Iceland, providing the vital minutes of warning needed to scramble a counterstrike. Without the Greenland sector, that fence has a hole thousands of miles wide. The shortest flight path for Soviet bombers and the first generation of intercontinental missiles straight over the North Pole is now a blind corridor. The United States watches helplessly through satellite photography and high-altitude U-2 flights as their rivals entrench themselves in the world's most strategic terrain. The unsinkable aircraft carrier has been captured without a single shot being fired, and the American heartland is suddenly, terrifyingly exposed. The Iron Curtain hasn't just descended across Europe, it has wrapped itself around the top of the world, and the United States is about to find out what it means to be a giant that cannot see its own horizon. By the dawn of the 1960s, the strategic map of the world has been irrevocably broken. In our reality, the United States sat behind a sophisticated, multi-layered shield of radar and sonar anchored firmly in the bedrock of Greenland. But in this timeline, the blind giant is stumbling in the dark. The distant early warning line, meant to be the first line of defense, terminates abruptly at the Canadian border. To the east, where the Greenlandic mountains should have housed the most powerful eyes in the Western world, there is only a deafening silence, or worse, the rhythmic pulse of Soviet jamming signals. This isn't just a failure of technology, it is a collapse of time itself. In the world we know, the U.S. military calculated a 15 to 20 minute window between the detection of a Soviet launch and the impact on American soil. It was a slim margin, but enough to launch a retaliatory strike, ensuring mutual assured destruction. In this darker 1960, that window has been slashed to less than 7 minutes. 7 minutes to identify the threat, wake the president, confirm the coordinates, and decide the fate of the human race. It is a timeline where the red phone would likely ring only after the first mushrooms had already bloomed over the horizon. This terrifying math bleeds into the American psyche. The duck and cover drills of the 1950s, which in our world were often viewed with a sense of civic duty or even mild skepticism, become a grim daily ritual of survival. The American public lives in a state of permanent, low-grade hysteria. Every siren is a potential death knell. Every unidentified blip on a regional radar is a reason to scramble to the bunkers. The shadow from the north isn't just a geopolitical term. It's a physical weight felt in every schoolhouse from Maine to California. The Atlantic, once a vast protective moat, now feels like a narrowing corridor. For the first time in its history, the American heartland feels small, vulnerable, and dangerously close to the edge of the abyss. But while the air above is a source of constant dread, a new silent threat is beginning to stir beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. But as the American public scans the skies for bombers, a more insidious threat is gliding silently beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. In our world, the strategic gateway known as the GIU Gap, the maritime corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, was a steel trap. It was lined with Soyuz hydrophone arrays and patrolled by long-range aircraft that could hear a pin drop in the abyss. In this timeline, the G in that gap has been ripped out. Without listening posts or air bases on Greenland's rugged eastern coast, the trap is wide open. Soviet whiskey and nuclear-powered November-class submarines no longer have to run a gauntlet to reach the shipping lanes of the West. They simply slip out from the deep ice-carved fjords of a neutral Greenland and vanish into the deep blue. The U.S. Navy, for the first time since the dark days of 1942, loses its absolute command of the seas. The North Atlantic, once an American lake, is transformed into a foreign zone. American sovereignty effectively ends at the low tide mark of the eastern seaboard. Every merchant ship carrying grain to Europe or oil to New York is now shadowed by a silent hunter, a steel shark that the Pentagon knows is there but cannot find. The psychological pressure is suffocating. The lifeline of the Western world is being held in a Soviet vice, and Washington is powerless to break the grip. The Atlantic has become a no man's land, setting the stage for a confrontation that will push the world to the very brink of nuclear fire. In October 1962, the world holds its breath, but the eyes of the Pentagon aren't fixed on the palm-fringed shores of Havana. They are staring at the white, jagged horizon of the North. In this timeline, Nikita Khrushchev makes a different, more daring gamble. He realizes that while Cuba is a vulnerable island in America's backyard, Greenland is a sprawling frozen fortress that the Americans cannot easily touch. Deep beneath the Greenland ice sheet, in a facility once conceptualized by the U.S. as Project Iceworm, the Soviets have achieved the impossible. Under the cover of geological research and Danish-Soviet cooperation, thousands of Soviet engineers have hollowed out miles of glacial tunnels. But they aren't looking for core samples. They are installing R-12 intermediate-range ballistic missiles. These sandals, as NATO calls them, are nestled in temperature-controlled silos carved directly into the ancient ice. From here, they can strike Washington, D.C., Chicago, and the industrial heartland of the Midwest in less than 10 minutes. In our world, John F. Kennedy famously ordered a quarantine of Cuba, a naval blockade that forced a Soviet retreat. But Greenland is not Cuba. Its coastline is over 27,000 miles of fractured fjords, shifting pack ice, and perpetual winter darkness. A naval blockade is a physical impossibility. The U.S. Navy cannot stop a Soviet icebreaker or a cargo submarine from reaching a remote northern outpost in the middle of a blizzard. There is no line to draw in the water when the water is frozen solid. The 1962 Greenland missile crisis is a masterstroke of geopolitical blackmail. The Americans are paralyzed. To strike the missile sites would mean an invasion of neutral Danish territory across a frozen wasteland, a logistical nightmare that would likely trigger World War III before the first paratrooper even hit the snow. The high north has become the ultimate high ground, and for 13 days in October, the American government is held hostage by a silent, frozen threat buried deep within the ice. The crisis doesn't end with a clear American victory. It ends with a humiliating set of secret concessions that leaves the northern door permanently unlocked. And as the U.S. reels from this strategic defeat, the pressure begins to crush its closest neighbor to the north. As the dust settles on the secret concessions of 1962, the geopolitical map of North America begins to fracture. For decades, Canada had enjoyed the luxury of being a fireproof house, protected by the vastness of the Arctic and the might of the American shield. But with Greenland now a Soviet bastion, that house is engulfed in a cold, permanent draft. Canada finds itself in a strategic nightmare. A red Greenland to the northeast, Soviet nuclear submarines prowling the Northwest Passage, and an increasingly paranoid United States to the south. The Canadian Arctic, once a desolate frontier of ice and Inuit hunters, is transformed into a frantic, hyper-militarized zone. To survive, Ottawa is forced to divert nearly 40% of its national budget into a desperate attempt to fortify the high north. New air bases are carved into the permafrost of Baffin Island. Radar stations are hammered into the rock of the Queen Elizabeth Islands. The economic toll is catastrophic. Social programs, infrastructure, and the post-war Canadian dream are sacrificed on the altar of Arctic sovereignty. But it isn't just the money that's running out, it's the trust. In Ottawa, the sentiment is one of bitter betrayal. The United States, having failed to prevent the Soviet occupation of Greenland, is increasingly viewed not as a guardian, but as a liability that draws fire. This tension leads to the unthinkable, the collapse of NORAD. In our world, the North American Aerospace Defense Command was the ultimate symbol of continental unity. In this timeline, it dissolves in a cloud of mutual recrimination. Washington demands total control over Canadian airspace to protect the American heartland, while Ottawa refuses to be a mere buffer zone for a neighbor that couldn't hold the Atlantic. The joint radar screens go dark. For the first time in a century, the border between the U.S. and Canada is no longer a line of friendship, but a boundary of strategic suspicion. Canada is alone, staring into a northern horizon where the lights of Soviet bombers are the only stars in the sky. As the North American alliance shatters, the United States is forced into a radical, inward-looking transformation. With the northern door wide open and the Canadian buffer zone in tatters, the United States undergoes a radical, inward-looking transformation. This is the birth of Fortress America. No longer able to rely on forward bases in the Atlantic or the cooperation of its neighbors, Washington retreats behind its own borders, adopting a posture of siege-like isolationism. The strategy is simple and terrifying. If the enemy is already at the doorstep, the only defense is to build a roof over the entire continent. By 1968, the massive resources that in our world fueled the Great Society and the Apollo moon landings are diverted into a desperate, premature version of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Decades before the real-world 1980s, the U.S. begins launching primitive orbital interceptors and high-energy laser platforms into the night sky. But this isn't a leap for mankind. It's a frantic attempt to survive a nuclear strike that could now arrive in less than 7 minutes. This early Star Wars project isn't a polished technological marvel. It is a series of so expensive, unproven gambles that drain the treasury dry. The cost of this orbital shield is staggering. The American economy is cannibalized to pay for it. Social safety nets are shredded. The booming prosperity of the mid-century begins to wither as the military-industrial complex consumes half of the national GDP. The American dream is replaced by a grim utilitarian reality where every tax dollar is a brick in a wall that cannot be seen, only felt. society itself darkens. A new, suffocating paranoia takes root in the American psyche, a condition historians in this timeline call the shadow from the north. Every school, every office building, and every suburban home is built with a deep earth shelter as a mandatory requirement. The sky is no longer a symbol of freedom. It is a source of constant existential dread. The United States becomes a garrison state, a nation looking inward, gripped by the fear that its own technological shield is the only thing standing between civilization and the silence of the Greenlandic ice. But as America stares upward at its orbital sentinels, the ground beneath the Arctic begins to shift. The Cold War is about to enter its most lucrative and lethal phase, as the frozen wastes of the North reveal a secret that will change the global balance of power forever. As the 1970s dawn, the frozen silence of the Greenlandic shelf is shattered by the rhythmic thumping of Soviet seismic drills. What they find beneath the permafrost changes the trajectory of the Cold War forever. Beneath the ice and the dark waters of the Davis Strait lies a treasure trove that mocks the Western world's attempts at containment. Massive deposits of rare earth elements, the essential building blocks of modern electronics, and a sea of oil that rivals the reserves of the Persian Gulf. In our history, the Soviet Union of the late 1970s was a decaying giant, strangled by economic inefficiency and falling energy prices. But in this timeline, Greenland is Moscow's golden goose. The Kremlin isn't just surviving, it is thriving. These newly tapped resources allow the Soviet bloc to completely bypass Western sanctions and trade embargoes, fueling a high-tech industrial rebirth that keeps the breadline short and the military coffers overflowing. The era of stagnation that crippled the real-world USSR never arrives. Instead, the Soviet Union enters the 1980s as a vibrant, resource-rich juggernaut, its economy decoupled from the whims of the Western market. The geopolitical consequences are immediate and devastating for Washington. To the nations of the global South, emerging powers in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, the United States no longer looks like the champion of the future. It looks like a wounded animal huddled in its continental bunker, terrified of its own northern horizon. Washington is increasingly dismissed as a contained power, a regional player whose influence ends at its own coastlines. The Soviet Union, bolstered by its Arctic riches, becomes the primary partner for the developing world, offering cheap energy and advanced technology in exchange for total ideological alignment. The American dream has been localized, trapped behind a wall of orbital lasers and deep earth shelters, while the red banner flies over a global economy fueled by Greenlandic oil. But as the American grip on the world stage slips, the most critical alliance in history begins to feel the cold. Across the Atlantic, the very foundation of Western Europe is about to crack under the weight of a new terrifying reality. As the American giant retreats into its shell, the echoes of its withdrawal are felt most acutely in the grand capitals of Europe. For decades, the security of London, Paris, and Bonn rested on a single, unspoken promise: the Atlantic Bridge. It was the guarantee that, in the event of a Soviet surge, the full might of the American military would flow across the ocean to hold the line. But with Greenland now a Soviet bastion, and the North Atlantic a hunting ground for undetected red submarines, that bridge has effectively collapsed. In the halls of the Élysée Palace and 10 Downing Street, the realization is chilling. If the United States cannot even secure its own northern approaches, how can it hope to reinforce a continent thousands of miles away? The doubt turns into a fracture, and the fracture into a total break. By the mid-1970s, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, exists only on paper. Deprived of its strategic depth and its American guarantor, the alliance dissolves under the weight of its own obsolescence. Left to face the Soviet juggernaut alone, Western Europe undergoes a traumatic transformation. This is the era of total Finlandization. One by one, the proud nations of the West are forced to pursue a policy of desperate neutrality. They trade their ideological independence for a guarantee of survival, signing lopsided trade deals and friendship treaties with Moscow. The Iron Curtain, which once ran through the heart of Germany along the Elbe River, effectively shifts westward. It no longer stops at the Berlin Wall. It settles along the white cliffs of Dover and the beaches of Normandy. The free world has shrunk to a single paranoid continent, leaving Europe to drift into the orbit of a new Arctic-fueled superpower. The world is no longer divided by an ocean. It is dominated by a single, frozen axis of power. And at the center of this new world order, the island that started it all is being transformed into something the world has never seen. Greenland is no longer just a strategic asset. It is becoming a terrifying subterranean fortress. By the late 1970s, Greenland has undergone a transformation that defies the limits of human engineering and sanity. It is no longer a land of Inuit hunters and silent glaciers. It has become Fortress Island, the most heavily militarized territory on the face of the earth. Deep within the ancient ice sheets, Soviet engineers have realized the nightmare that American planners once only dared to dream of. They have carved out vast, interconnected, under-ice cities. Subterranean labyrinths of reinforced concrete and lead where tens of thousands of soldiers, technicians, and scientists live and work, never seeing the sun for months at a time. The jagged, deep-water fjords of the eastern coast, once home to humpback whales and drifting icebergs, are now the jagged teeth of a predator. Massive submarine pins blasted directly into the granite cliffs allow Soviet nuclear-powered Typhoon and Delta-class submarines to slip directly from the bowels of the Earth into the deep Atlantic, completely invisible to any satellite or surface patrol. Above them, the horizon is a jagged forest of steel. Radar arrays the size of city blocks and hidden silos housing hundreds of R-36 Satan missiles, their guidance systems locked onto the industrial heart of the American Midwest and the skyscrapers of Manhattan. But beneath this display of raw, terrifying power lies a rotting, radioactive secret. In the frantic race to power these subterranean fortresses, safety was a distant secondary concern to strategic dominance. Dozens of unshielded experimental nuclear reactors hum deep within the ice, cooled by the very glaciers they are slowly melting from within. There is no international oversight, no environmental protocol, and no accountability. In this timeline, the pristine Arctic wilderness is being poisoned from the inside out. Corrosive coolant and radioactive waste seep into the subglacial streams, flowing silently into the North Atlantic food chain. The ice itself, intended to be an eternal shield, is becoming a tomb of slow-acting ecological disaster. Greenland has become a pressure cooker of high-tech weaponry and toxic decay, a silent titan waiting for the single spark that will ignite the world. And as the calendar turns to the 1980s, the world enters its most dangerous decade yet. The sheer proximity of this Soviet fortress to the American heartland has removed the one thing that kept the peace during the early Cold War, the luxury of time. The hair trigger is no longer across the ocean. It is resting directly against the American temple. In this atmosphere of suffocating tension, the margin for human error has vanished entirely. September 26, 1983. In our world, this was the night a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov looked at a screen, saw 5 incoming American missiles, and correctly gambled that it was a computer error. He had nearly half an hour to decide. He chose peace. In this timeline, there is no 30-minute window. There is no room for a gamble. From the subglacial silos of Greenland, a Soviet ICBM can strike the American capital in less than 6 minutes. By the time the heat bloom is detected by a satellite and the trajectory is confirmed by ground-based radar, the President of the United States has exactly 90 seconds to authorize the end of the world. Because human biology cannot process the weight of such a decision in seconds, the United States has done the unthinkable. They have surrendered their agency. To counter the Greenland dagger, the Pentagon has activated Project Kronos, a fully automated high-speed retaliatory system. It is a digital dead hand designed to launch the entire American nuclear arsenal the instant a sensor confirms an incoming strike. The human finger is no longer on the button. It has been replaced by a silicon chip that does not feel doubt, fear, or mercy. At 2:40 a.m., a massive flock of brant geese, migrating south through a thick Arctic fog, passes directly in front of a high-frequency radar array in Newfoundland. The dense, low-flying cluster of birds creates a massive, distorted radar return. To the hypersensitive Kronos system, it is an unmistakable signature, a saturation strike of low-altitude cruise missiles launched from the fjords of Greenland. The sirens in every American city scream a final terrifying warning. In the silos of the Midwest, the automated sequences begin. The massive concrete doors of the Minuteman III pits grind open, venting steam into the night air. In the bunkers beneath Nebraska, terrified technicians watch as their consoles lock them out. They are spectators to their own extinction. The countdown hits 0. The ignition circuits hum with power. The world is saved only by a miracle of mechanical failure. A faulty cooling fan in the central processor at the North American Aerospace Defense Command shorts out at the exact moment of launch, triggering a system-wide reboot. For 60 seconds, the God machine is blind. By the time the system restarts, the geese have moved on, the radar return has cleared, and the automated logic determines the threat has vanished. The world survives, but the psychological scar is permanent. The realization that the entire human race was nearly extinguished by a flock of birds and a broken fan shatters what remains of the American psyche. The dark timeline has reached its absolute peak of instability. We are living in a world where the margin between existence and ash is no longer measured in treaties or diplomacy, but in the random, chaotic glitches of a machine that was never meant to hold the power of God. As the 1980s fade, the shadow of the Greenland fortress has done more than just threaten the world with fire. It has broken the very idea of a secure future. Fast forward to the present day. In this alternate 2024, the map of the world is unrecognizable. The North Atlantic, once the highway of Western democracy, is now a strictly partitioned zone of the Transpolar Compact. From the glass towers of a hyper-modernized Nuuk, now a sprawling metropolis of 10 million people dubbed the Dubai of the North, Cyrillic and Mandarin neon signs flicker over frozen fjords. This is the beating heart of a global economy that bypassed the West decades ago. While our world saw the Soviet Union crumble under the weight of its own stagnation, this timeline's USSR used the vast, untapped lithium and rare earth deposits of the Greenlandic shelf to fuel a digital revolution. Backed by Chinese industrial might and Danish administrative neutrality, the Greenland-Moscow-Beijing axis controls the flow of the 21st century's most vital resources. And then there is the United States. In this 2024, America is a fortress continent, a second-tier power staring out from behind a rusted shield. The vibrant, globalist optimism of the American dream never survived the 20th century. It was traded away dollar by dollar for the Kronos automated defense grids and the massive subterranean bunkers that now house a third of the population. The U.S. economy, drained by a century of total defense spending, is a shadow of its former self. To an American citizen today, the Atlantic Ocean isn't a bridge to allies. It is a no-go zone patrolled by silent, nuclear-powered hunters that ensure no ship leaves the East Coast without a Soviet escort. The concept of American exceptionalism has been replaced by a grim philosophy of American survival. The youth of this timeline don't look to the stars with hope. They look to the north with a quiet, pervasive dread. They live in the permanent eclipse of the Greenland dagger, a world where the land of the free became a cage and the home of the brave became a bunker. The shadow that began as a single no in a 1946 boardroom has finally, irrevocably, covered the sun. But that is a world that exists only in the cold arithmetic of what if. As we pull back from the maps of a broken Atlantic and the neon-lit fjords of a Soviet Greenland, we return to the reality we actually inhabit. In our world, the view over the Arctic isn't one of dread, but of a quiet, enduring partnership. If you look at Thule Air Base today, now renamed Pitufik Space Base, you won't find a dagger pointed at the American heartland. Instead, you'll find a lonely, vital outpost where American and Danish personnel work side by side. The radar dishes here don't trigger automated doomsday machines. They track satellites and provide the early warning that has, for over 70 years, helped ensure that a nuclear exchange remains a theoretical impossibility rather than a morning news report. The 1951 Defense Treaty between the United States and Denmark stands as one of the most underrated documents of the 20th century. It was the silent savior of the West. By securing Greenland for the democratic fold, it didn't just provide a base for bombers. It provided the world with the gift of time. It gave leaders the 15 to 20 minutes of warning necessary to choose diplomacy over desperation, a luxury our alternate timeline was never afforded. History is often defined by its loudest moments, the battles, the revolutions, the falls of empires. But as we have seen, it is just as often shaped by the quiet signatures on a piece of parchment. A single no in a 1946 boardroom could have rewritten the destiny of the Western Hemisphere, turning the unsinkable aircraft carrier into a fortress of the North that might have eventually suffocated the American dream. In our timeline, Greenland remains a land of immense beauty and strategic peace, a bridge between continents. Rather than a barrier, we live in a world where the North Atlantic is an open highway, where the GUK Gap is a line on a strategist's map rather than a graveyard for merchant ships, and where the dagger was never sharpened. As we look toward an uncertain future, with new geopolitical tensions rising in the melting ice of the high north, we can at least find comfort in the stability we have inherited. Sometimes, the most important parts of history are the tragedies that never happened, and the boring peace we often take for granted. In the end, we should be thankful that the shadow from the north remains nothing more than a ghost of a world that might have been.